In the deep shadows of history, beneath the dramatic marches of armies and the thunder of muskets, there exists another world, a world of whispers, coded messages, invisible ink, forged loyalties, and sworn silence. This world did not echo with the roar of revolution, yet it shaped the very fate of the nation that would become the United States of America. When we speak of the American Revolution, we often imagine the grand scenes of battlefield heroism, Washington crossing the icy Delaware, Minutemen standing firm at Lexington, or the ragged victory at Yorktown. But hidden behind these iconic images lies a secret war, one fought in taverns by candlelight, across oceans in intercepted letters, through double agents walking among trusted friends, and by farmers turned silent patriots carrying intelligence sewn into coat linings. This was the war of America's first spies, the invisible architects of independence. This secret world was not born of luxury or professional espionage. It was born from necessity. In 1775, the 13 colonies were not a nation, not yet. They were isolated settlements stretched along a coastline more than 1,000 miles long. They shared a dream of freedom from the British crown, yet they were deeply vulnerable. Great Britain was the most powerful empire in the world, commanded the strongest navy on earth, and possessed a global network of intelligence. Against such a giant, the American cause did not stand a chance, not without strategy deeper than muskets and militias. George Washington, a commander with no formal training in espionage, understood this more clearly than anyone. He knew that independence could not be secured by courage alone. It needed secrecy, deception, and intelligence. And so, at the dawn of revolution, he quietly built a spy network that would become the foundation for modern American intelligence. To understand the importance of this hidden war, we must step back from the battlefield maps and march orders and instead listen to the silence between them, the coded messages written in invisible ink, the brief glances passed between informants, the notes buried in fields under rocks, and the whispered warnings that saved American lives before the first shot was fired. Independence was not won only on snowy battlefields. It was secured in letters smuggled past redcoats, in loyalists turned double-crossers, in secret societies forged out of trust and risk. The Founding Fathers, often remembered as philosophers of freedom, were also masters of deception. Benjamin Franklin was more than a statesman. He was a calculated manipulator of information, feeding false intelligence through British circles in Paris, reshaping the war with a smile. John Jay, known for his role in shaping the Constitution, was also one of America's earliest counterintelligence pioneers. Nathan Hale, though remembered only for his famous last words, was part of a much broader movement of young patriots willing to die for intelligence. The American Revolution was not simply a war for territory, it was a war of ideas, signals, symbols, and secrets. Every letter was a weapon. Every conversation could determine victory or defeat. In New York City, captured by the British early in the war, Washington created one of the most successful spy rings in world history, the Culper Ring. Composed of ordinary men and women, farmers, merchants, and printers, they operated in complete secrecy, even from the Continental Army itself. The names of its members would remain hidden for more than a century, protected by codes so complex that British forces never discovered their existence. Their work allowed Washington to predict enemy movements, disrupt supply lines, and avoid traps that would have ended the revolution long before Yorktown. But this secret war did not begin with the Culper Ring. Long before Washington's elaborate networks were established, the seeds of espionage were planted. The Sons of Liberty, led by fiery patriots like Samuel Adams, were more than a protest movement, they were a conspiracy network. They tapped into channels of information across colonial societies, using messengers on horseback, signals from church steeples, and whispered networks that flowed through taverns. Paul Revere, the silversmith immortalized in poetry, was a skilled intelligence courier who operated inside an information web spanning Boston and beyond. The Boston Tea Party, now remembered as a dramatic act of rebellion, was the product of careful intelligence gathering, coded planning, and secrecy that reached across social boundaries. America's first spies were not trained professionals. They were ordinary people whose courage outweighed their fear. They risked everything, families, property, and their own lives. The British punished espionage with swift brutality. Nathan Hale's execution was not an exception, it was a warning. Anyone caught spying for the Continental Army would face the noose. Still, the Patriots continued. Their motives were shaped by the idea of liberty. They believed that freedom was worth the ultimate risk, and they fought a war where every secret carried the weight of a nation not yet born. This documentary dives into the hidden layers of the American Revolution. We will explore the birth of America's first intelligence operations, their origins, their methods, and their impact on the war. We will reveal how Washington transformed from a battlefield general into a spymaster, how invisible ink and codebooks became as valuable as cannons, and how the trust between a small group of anonymous patriots changed the course of history. We will uncover the dangerous dance between loyalty and betrayal, where double agents played both sides to survive, and where the line between patriot and traitor was often blurred by desperation. We will examine how espionage reshaped key events, how intelligence prevented a massacre at the Battle of Long Island, revealed Benedict Arnold's treason, and secured French support that turned the tide of war. We will discover how ordinary lives intersected with extraordinary missions, like Anna Strong, who used laundry on a clothesline to signal secret drop points, or Robert Townsend, a quiet merchant whose words and coded letters reached directly into Washington's camp. Behind every battlefield victory was a quiet whisper, a stolen document, or a coded letter delivered at the right time. In the end, America's independence was not only declared, it was constructed through secrecy. The Founding Fathers understood that the dream of a nation must be protected not only by words and weapons but by intelligence and strategy. The very foundation of modern American espionage, from the CIA to counterintelligence agencies, can be traced back to this moment, to the flicker of candlelight in a hidden meeting room, to the invisible ink drying on parchment, to the whisper of a patriot riding through forests in the night. This was the unseen war for freedom, fought by those whose names history almost forgot. America's first spies did not wear uniforms. They did not lead armies or draft declarations, but they shaped the future of the United States in silence. Their sacrifice was not marked by monuments or medals, but by the fact that their work succeeded. The nation they risked everything for exists today. This documentary tells their story, the story of how a handful of secret patriots, working in the shadows, changed the destiny of a continent. It is a story of courage without applause, victory without glory, and freedom born from secrecy. Welcome to America's First Spies, the secret war for independence. The movement for American independence did not rise with sudden fury. It emerged gradually, shaped by decades of accumulated tensions, evolving political consciousness, and a quiet recognition that power in the colonies did not truly belong to the colonists themselves. Before the first shots echoed across Lexington Green, a different kind of battle was underway, a battle of ideas. The British Empire viewed its colonies as sources of revenue and strategic footholds, not as self-determined societies. London's lawmakers, separated by an ocean from the daily realities of the New World, imposed taxes without representation, restricted trade, and tightened control through laws designed to extract wealth and maintain authority. For many colonists, especially those who considered themselves loyal British subjects, this intrusion was not merely a financial burden, it was an assault on their identity and autonomy. The seeds of rebellion were planted not in the minds of radicals alone, but in ordinary citizens who believed their freedoms were being eroded. The aftermath of the French and Indian War in 1763 transformed relations between the colonies and the Crown. Britain emerged victorious, but heavily indebted. To offset the cost of war and maintain military presence in North America, Parliament introduced a series of revenue laws, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and eventually the Townshend Acts. Each law was met with resistance, inspiring assemblies, boycotts, and pamphlets that spread across the colonies like wildfire. What began as economic protests soon took on a deeper ideological tone. Colonists asked themselves a question that would reshape the course of history: if we are British citizens, why are we denied the rights British law promises? The answer, slowly revealed through experience and argument, was that the colonies were not partners in an empire, they were subjects governed from afar. It was in these early days of resistance that the importance of information became clear. British officials stationed in America reported every colonial protest to London. Colonial assemblies and committees, in turn, monitored British movements, watched for changes in policy, and communicated through networks that transcended provincial borders. The idea of a united colonial front was still distant, but the mechanisms that would eventually support a revolution were quietly developing. In taverns, where travelers gathered and news flowed from one region to another, ideas about liberty spread without formal leadership. Newspapers became powerful tools, printing arguments that challenged British authority while hiding the identity of their authors. Writers like John Dickinson, through works such as Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, framed the conversation around rights and liberties rather than taxes alone. The most influential early force behind organized resistance was the emergence of the Sons of Liberty. Founded in Boston by Samuel Adams and other passionate patriots, the Sons of Liberty understood something that others did not: information is power. Their protests were not impulsive, they were organized with precision and secrecy. When the Stamp Act was passed in 1765, the Sons of Liberty mobilized networks of artisans, merchants, and working-class colonists, producing a unified resistance that reached beyond New England. They used coded messages, clandestine meetings, and secret plans to organize massive demonstrations while avoiding British infiltration. By day, their members appeared as ordinary citizens. By night, they became architects of rebellion. While early protests were often loud and public, another layer of resistance operated quietly. Merchants gathered intelligence on British trade routes, smugglers distributed goods in defiance of British law, and sympathetic members within colonial governments leaked information to activists. What looked like spontaneous uprisings were often carefully timed events driven by hidden conversations and secret coordination. Even at this early stage, what would eventually become a revolutionary intelligence network was forming, not as a formal entity, but as a collection of individuals who understood that secrecy protected their cause from punishment. Then came March 5, 1770, the Boston Massacre. In a clash between British soldiers and angry colonists, 5 men were killed in the streets. The event became a symbol of oppression, spread through dramatic engravings by Paul Revere and inflammatory writing designed to turn public opinion. The massacre was not simply a tragedy, it was a revelation. The colonists saw clearly that British military presence was not for their protection, but for control. It was a moment when fear turned into anger, and anger transformed into resolve. 3 years later, resistance took a dramatic leap forward. The Tea Act of 1773, intended to save the financially troubled British East India Company, effectively forced colonists to buy British tea, undermining local merchants. In response, the Sons of Liberty organized what would become an iconic act of defiance, the Boston Tea Party. Disguised as Native Americans, participants boarded ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. The operation was executed without violence, yet with extreme secrecy. Not a single participant confessed for years, despite investigations, bribes, and pressure. This silence revealed something profound: a hardened network of individuals committed to protecting each other against the full power of the British Empire. Britain responded with fury. The coercive acts, known to the colonists as the Intolerable Acts, closed Boston Harbor, dissolved local assemblies, and imposed military rule. Suddenly, the struggle was not just political, it was existential. The Crown had moved from taxation to direct punishment, and this overreach backfired. Instead of isolating rebellious Massachusetts, it united the colonies. Delegates from across the continent gathered in the First Continental Congress in 1774, forging a common identity and a shared purpose. They organized committees to monitor British activity, exchange intelligence, and enforce boycotts. For the first time, the colonies acted not as separate provinces, but as a coordinated body. The groundwork for espionage had evolved beyond tavern whispers into formal structures. Systems of couriers, messengers, and coded correspondence were established to connect far-flung regions of the colonial world. Yet, the true beginning of the movement came not in declarations or congresses, but in the minds of ordinary Americans. The idea that a distant king could not hold absolute power over people who lived on another continent was revolutionary in itself. Pamphleteers like Thomas Paine drove the argument further. In January 1776, Paine published Common Sense, a searing condemnation of monarchy that sold more than 100,000 copies in its first months, an astonishing number in a world without mass printing. Paine's words spread like wildfire through communities, igniting a belief that independence was not only necessary, it was natural. Behind all these ideological shifts lay a hidden infrastructure of communication. Riders on horseback carried letters through backroads to avoid British patrols. Church bells signaled meetings. Sympathetic printers circulated revolutionary essays under pseudonyms. Women played a subtle but critical role, sharing information in social circles that men rarely entered and disguising intelligence in household items so it passed unnoticed. The revolution was being shaped by people who would never be recognized by history textbooks. As tensions escalated, the need for reliable intelligence became urgent. Both sides understood that the next move could determine everything. British spies operated within colonial assemblies, reporting on speeches and decisions to their commanders. Colonial activists, suspecting leaks, began to test loyalties, exposing informants and tightening their circles. Distrust spread like smoke through the halls of power. This was the dawn of American counterintelligence, driven not by formal agencies, but by necessity and suspicion. On April 18, 1775, when British troops marched toward Concord to seize colonial weapons, they were met not by surprise, but by prepared resistance. Paul Revere's midnight ride was not an isolated act of bravery, it was the result of a highly organized alarm system that involved dozens of riders, prearranged signals, and networks of informants who had been tracking British movements for weeks. When the first shots rang out at Lexington the next morning, marking the beginning of open war, the revolution was already well underway in the shadows. The beginning of the movement for independence was not a linear story, it was a mosaic of resistance, intelligence, and evolving identity. Every law passed in London, every protest in Boston, every pamphlet printed in Philadelphia contributed to a growing awareness: the colonies could not remain subjects of a distant empire forever. But the most important element of this awakening was the way colonists learned to communicate in secrecy, protect their information, and plan in confidence. Without these early networks, the revolution might have been crushed before it began. The American Revolution did not start with gunpowder, it started with ideas, whispers, and signals passed through windows in the night. It began when ordinary people, living ordinary lives, decided that silence was no longer safety, that their future required risk, and their dreams demanded secrecy. The hidden foundations of the movement laid the groundwork for what would become America's first intelligence operations. Before the Continental Army marched into battle, the colonies had already discovered a powerful truth: knowledge is the first weapon of freedom. This is the hidden chapter of the American Revolution. A chapter written in code. When war erupted openly in 1775, the American colonies found themselves staring into the face of a powerful empire without a navy, without a stable army, without money, and most critically, without a trusted system to gather information. The British could deploy seasoned generals, well-trained regiments, and a vast network of informants across the empire. The Americans, by contrast, were improvising a war machine from scratch, struggling to unify militias that had never served together. The Revolution's early years were defined by hardship, betrayal, and uncertainty. And at the center of this struggle stood figures whose decisions would shape not only the outcome of the war, but the very creation of American intelligence. No figure was more essential to this hidden war than George Washington. The image often painted of Washington, a stoic commander riding at the front of his troops, is only half the story. Behind the scenes, Washington was calculating, deceptive, and deeply aware that knowledge could compensate for weakness. His experience in the French and Indian War had taught him painful lessons. Battles are often won before shots are fired, and armies fail not from lack of bravery but from lack of information. When he accepted command of the Continental Army in June 1775, Washington inherited a force held together by patriotism but lacking discipline, supply, and organization. One of his earliest concerns was not cannons or uniforms, it was intelligence. He understood that every troop movement, every British patrol, every whisper in New York taverns could determine the fate of the revolution. Under Washington's leadership, a quiet transformation began. The general developed a network of scouts and informants that expanded across Boston and into the British ranks themselves. One of his earliest agents was Dr. Benjamin Church, once considered a trusted patriot. Church was charismatic, wealthy, and held influence within the revolutionary movement. He rose quickly, becoming chief physician of the Continental Army. But unknown to Washington, Church was feeding intelligence to British commanders. His letters, written in code, revealed troop positions and strategic plans. When the coded messages were intercepted and deciphered, Church's betrayal shocked the patriots. For Washington, the lesson was brutal: espionage can destroy a revolution from within. From that point on, he demanded secrecy with military precision, refusing to rely on enthusiasm alone. Every agent had to be tested. Every message protected. Trust was earned, not given. This environment of suspicion shaped the early struggles of the revolution. The Americans could not match British firepower, but they could, and had to, outthink them. Washington began experimenting with code and deception. He used double agents, planted false information, and forged letters designed to confuse British commanders. He began to view war not simply as the clash of armies, but as the control of perception. In this world, truth was a weapon, and lies could save lives. One of his most famous tactics involved exaggerated troop numbers and imaginary reinforcements. British intelligence, confident in their superiority, often believed the false reports and hesitated to strike, allowing Washington's fragile army time to regroup. But while Washington began building his intelligence web, other figures were laying the philosophical and political foundations of the revolution. Benjamin Franklin, one of the most recognizable figures of the era, operated on a battlefield without muskets, the salons of Europe. Franklin's public role in France was that of a charming diplomat, an icon of American democracy. But in the shadows, he was a manipulator of information. Franklin understood that the revolution could not survive without foreign support. France was the key. The old empire sought revenge for its defeat in the French and Indian War, and Franklin turned that desire into opportunity. He orchestrated a campaign of influence, planting stories that exaggerated American strength and minimized British success. He allowed certain letters to be intercepted, knowing they would fall into British hands and shape strategy. In France, Franklin became the architect of psychological warfare, a master of propaganda who could alter the course of battle without stepping onto a field. Another critical figure was John Jay, later the first Chief Justice of the United States. Jay's contributions to the revolution often go unnoticed, overshadowed by battlefield heroes. But Jay was one of America's earliest counterintelligence experts. He served on the Committee for Detecting Conspiracies, a group tasked with uncovering Loyalist plots and protecting the colonies from British infiltration. Jay's meticulous work dismantled spy rings operating in New York and exposed threats before they could strike. His approach was methodical. He relied on evidence, interrogation, and the careful management of information. In many ways, Jay's work marked the birth of American counterintelligence, where preventing enemy espionage became as important as gathering intelligence. Yet, for all the brilliant minds shaping secrecy at the highest level, perhaps no figure represents the courage of America's first spies more than Nathan Hale. A young schoolteacher turned soldier, Hale volunteered for a dangerous mission, enter British-occupied New York and gather information on troop movements. Hale had no training, no network, and no cover story beyond his earnest belief in the cause. Within days of entering the city, he was captured. British records suggest that Hale was betrayed by a loyalist. No elaborate interrogation was needed, his identity and mission were obvious. Hale's execution on September 22, 1776, was swift. Before his death, he spoke the words that would become immortal: "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." Hale's mission was a failure in practical terms, but a triumph of spirit. His sacrifice revealed the hunger within the colonies, the willingness to risk death for freedom. But it also exposed a harsh truth: patriotism alone could not win an intelligence war. Spies needed training, structure, and protection. That truth became clear during one of the Continental Army's most devastating early defeats, the Battle of Long Island. In August 1776, British forces launched a massive assault on New York, forcing Washington into retreat. The American army faced superior numbers, naval support, and professional soldiers. Had British commanders pressed their advantage, the war could have ended before it truly began. But thanks to a combination of cautious British strategy and intelligence Washington received from local informants, the Continental Army staged a daring nighttime evacuation across the East River. Under the cover of fog, the army slipped away, saving the revolution from collapse. This escape was not luck, it was the result of information gathered by unnamed patriots living under British rule, watching troop deployments from windows, and passing news in whispered conversations. These early agents would later form the backbone of the Culper Ring. The struggles of these early years revealed the fragile nature of the revolution. Supplies were scarce. Soldiers went unpaid. Winter brought suffering beyond imagination. At Valley Forge, men marched without shoes, leaving trails of blood in the snow. Disease threatened to destroy regiments faster than British bullets. Washington faced not only an external enemy, but the internal threat of collapse. Morale, unity, and discipline were as important as cannons. In this harsh winter camp, Washington refined his vision of war. He understood that brute force would not defeat an empire. The revolution required coordination across every colony, protection against betrayal, and a constant flow of reliable intelligence. At Valley Forge, he built a professional army. But he was also building something else, a professional intelligence network. Meanwhile, loyalist spies and British informants watched from the shadows, reporting on plans, mapping weaknesses. The British believed that the colonies would fracture under pressure. They saw the revolution as a rebellion of a few radicals, not a unified movement. But what they could not see, what even many Americans did not fully understand, was that under the hardship of war, a new identity was forming. 13 colonies, separated by distance, culture, and politics, were becoming something extraordinary, one people, united not by ancestry, but by purpose. The revolution's early struggles created the conditions that would lead to its greatest intelligence breakthroughs. Washington's search for reliable information would produce the Culper Ring. Franklin's manipulation of narrative would secure French alliance. Jay's counterintelligence work would safeguard the revolution from internal threats. And Hale's sacrifice would inspire a new generation of covert operatives willing to risk everything. These were the figures who shaped the hidden war, men working in darkness while their names would shine only centuries later. Their early failures taught hard lessons. Their limited successes prevented total defeat. And through these experiences, the revolution discovered a fundamental truth: independence could only be achieved if the Americans controlled the flow of information. Espionage was no longer a desperate improvisation, it was becoming a strategy. The dawn of American intelligence was born in suffering, betrayal, and uncertainty. But it was also born in determination, the refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. The early struggles of the revolution forged the tools that would eventually win it. And in the shadows of these battles, the spies of America were learning their craft. By 1777, the American Revolution stood at a crossroads. The early enthusiasm that had surged through the colonies was fading beneath the harsh reality of war. British forces controlled New York, the heart of the colonies, and used it as a base to divide and conquer. Washington's army was battered and exhausted. Supplies were scarce, promises from Congress remained unfulfilled, and the dream of independence seemed to be slipping away into winter shadows. Yet, it was in this moment of uncertainty that the revolution's greatest transformation began, one forged not through battlefield triumphs, but through strategic brilliance in the realm of espionage. The turning point in America's war for independence was not marked only by cannons and muskets, it emerged from pen strokes, coded letters, and the silent courage of spies who moved unseen through occupied streets. New York City, occupied by British forces after 1776, became the center of this invisible conflict. It was a city of divided loyalties. Merchants, farmers, soldiers, and civilians were tangled in a web of suspicion. British officers filled its streets, loyalists thrived under protection, and rebel sympathizers hid their allegiance behind careful words. In this environment of danger and opportunity, Washington recognized something vital: if the revolution was to survive, he needed reliable, structured, and professional intelligence. No more improvised scouting or untrained volunteers. No more Nathan Hale missions ending in tragedy. What the revolution needed was consistency, secrecy, and strategy. The answer came from an unexpected source, a quiet, unassuming officer named Benjamin Talmadge. Talmadge had served Washington faithfully, but his strength did not lie in dramatic heroism, it lay in organization and intellect. He understood the need for a network that could operate under British noses, gathering intelligence and transmitting it securely without exposing itself. Talmadge proposed the creation of a ring of spies based in and around New York City, ordinary citizens who could move through daily life unnoticed, blending into the backdrop of British occupation. Washington approved, and what followed became one of the most successful espionage operations in world history, the Culper Ring. The Culper Ring was born in secrecy in 1778, built on trust, anonymity, and innovation. Its members were not soldiers, they were farmers, merchants, and tradesmen who risked their lives in silence. Their names would remain hidden for more than a century. The ring's core included Abraham Woodhull, a farmer from Setauket, Robert Townsend, a quiet Quaker merchant in New York, and Caleb Brewster, a daring smuggler whose boats crossed Long Island Sound under the cover of darkness. Each member played a unique role, and each knew that exposure meant death. What set the Culper Ring apart from earlier efforts was its sophistication. Talmadge developed a numerical codebook, assigning numbers to names, places, and common phrases. Washington became 7-Eleven. New York was 727. Words like attack, troops, or departure were encoded into digits that only ring members could understand. Alongside codes came invisible ink, a special compound known as sympathetic stain, created by a physician named James J., brother of John J. The agent would write a seemingly harmless letter, a message about family or farm matters. But hidden between the lines, applied with invisible ink, were details of British troop movements, naval plans, and supply routes. Only when the correct chemical was brushed over the page would the secret text reveal itself. This innovation allowed intelligence to travel across British lines undetected, defeating even experienced inspectors. Equally ingenious was the method for exchanging information. Rather than direct contact, the ring used dead drops, hidden locations where messages could be left and retrieved without agents meeting face-to-face. Anna Strong, a local woman whose loyalty to the cause remained unshakable, used laundry on her clothesline as signals. A black petticoat hung outside meant Brewster was ready to travel. The number of handkerchiefs indicated the location of the drop point. Through such quiet gestures, intelligence crossed between New York and Washington's headquarters, eventually reaching the hands of the general himself. The Culper ring's work soon proved its worth. In 1780, Townsend uncovered a British plan to attack the French fleet as it sailed toward Rhode Island. This intelligence allowed Washington to reposition forces and protect his allies, preserving the vital French-American partnership that had begun to take shape. The ring also exposed fraudulent schemes that drained money from the Continental Army, protecting limited resources that meant the difference between survival and collapse. Most critically, the Culper ring identified a traitor operating within the American command, Benedict Arnold. Arnold had once been one of the Revolution's brightest stars, a daring commander known for his bold leadership at Saratoga. But as the war dragged on, Arnold grew resentful. He believed his contributions went unrecognized, his sacrifices unrewarded. The British, sensing opportunity, began a slow courtship. Major John Andre, a charismatic British officer, communicated with Arnold through coded letters, promising money, honor, and high rank if Arnold betrayed his country. Arnold agreed, offering to hand over West Point, a fortress whose capture could split the colonies and destroy the Continental Army's position on the Hudson River. It was the Culper ring, working tirelessly within New York, that intercepted hints of this conspiracy. Townsend's reports mentioned strange movements, unusual conversations, and encrypted messages moving through Loyalist channels. Meanwhile, other intelligence efforts uncovered fragments of the plot. When Andre was captured with incriminating documents hidden in his boot, the truth exploded like a cannon blast. Arnold escaped moments before capture, fleeing into British lines. Andre, the charming conduit of betrayal, was executed as a spy. The plot to deliver West Point into British hands collapsed, and with it, Britain's best chance to crush the revolution in a single stroke. This moment marked a turning point not only for the war, but for the concept of loyalty. The American people saw that betrayal could come from their own heroes. But they also saw that their survival depended on intelligence networks that could detect threats before they struck. Espionage was no longer a shadowy experiment, it was the heart of the revolution itself. While the Culper ring worked in secrecy, the grand stage of diplomacy shifted dramatically. Benjamin Franklin's efforts in France culminated in a powerful alliance. French money, soldiers, and naval power began to flow into the American cause. But this alliance was not a gift of sympathy, it was the result of carefully crafted narratives, staged information leaks, and strategic communication designed to convince the French that the Americans could win. Franklin used espionage to win diplomacy, just as Washington used diplomacy to fuel espionage. By 1781, the tide of war had turned. American forces were no longer isolated rebels, they were allies of a world power. British commanders, frustrated and uncertain, struggled to respond to enemy movements that seemed to anticipate their every step. Washington's strategies became bolder, shaped by the intelligence he received from the ring. When French Admiral de Grasse arrived with his fleet, Washington used deception to convince the British that he planned to attack New York. Instead, he marched south, coordinating with French forces to trap General Cornwallis at Yorktown. The siege was decisive. British hopes collapsed beneath the combined pressure of French naval power, American artillery, and the relentless will of a movement born in secrecy. Yorktown is remembered as a great battlefield victory. But behind that moment of triumph lay years of invisible work, coded letters written in candlelight, agents walking alone through dark streets, and men and women who risked their lives with no promise of recognition. The Culper Ring had done more than gather intelligence, they had altered the course of history. The turning point of the revolution was not one battle. It was a shift in understanding, that intelligence could overcome power, that secrecy could defeat strength, and that ordinary people working quietly could succeed where armies failed. The secret war had matured. What began as desperation had become expertly organized espionage. Washington, once a commander scrambling for information, now wielded intelligence as effectively as any weapon. The American Revolution did not turn on a single moment of glory. It turned on thousands of unseen decisions made in the dark, messages hidden between lines of ink, numbers written in codebooks, and signals hanging silently in the wind. The turning point was not declared, it was discovered by those moving in shadows. And it transformed the revolution from a struggle of resistance into a strategy of victory. By the early 1780s, the American Revolution had reached its most critical stage. The tide had turned, but victory was not guaranteed. The Continental Army remained under-resourced, the British still controlled major cities, and the colonies were exhausted by years of war. Diplomacy, deception, and determination carried the revolution forward, but beneath the surface of battles and treaties, the secret war continued to rage. It was here, at the peak of the conflict, that America's first spies faced their fiercest challenges, not only from the British enemy, but from the fragility of their own revolution. The Culper Ring, now deeply embedded within New York City and its surrounding communities, was operating at full strength. Their network had grown more refined, codes were updated, communication lines were diversified, and the risk of exposure loomed over every message. British counterintelligence had become more aggressive. Spies were hunted with increasing skill. British commanders, humiliated by the failure to secure West Point and troubled by unexpected American maneuvers, recognized that their enemies' intelligence capabilities were far more sophisticated than they had once believed. Unknown hands in the night were guiding Washington's decisions. Someone was haunting their plans, turning British strength into a liability. The secret war had become a game of hunter and hunted. The British, for their part, were not blind. They had their own network of informants spread across the colonies, men and women whose loyalties were shaped by promises, fears, or personal belief. Some were loyal to the crown, convinced that rebellion was madness. Others were opportunists, willing to sell secrets to the highest bidder. The British had developed a formidable system of intelligence, using taverns, ports, and military checkpoints to monitor colonial movements. Their officers were trained in deception. Their couriers moved through shadows. Their interception of letters and coded messages forced the Americans to innovate constantly. At the peak of the revolution, espionage was a duel without uniforms, one that demanded constant vigilance. For Washington, this duel was exhausting. He had to manage an army, negotiate with Congress, coordinate international diplomacy, and maintain secrecy across countless channels. Any breach could collapse the revolution overnight. Washington understood that information could not be hoarded, it had to be shared with discipline, protected with code, and delivered with precision. He personally reviewed intelligence reports, often writing in his own hand, disguising his thoughts under layers of ambiguity. He trusted the Culper Ring more than most of his generals. Their reports were not rumors or partisan whispers, they were the lifeline of his strategy. But while Washington worked in the shadows, the British command grew increasingly uncertain. General Clinton in New York faced a dilemma. He commanded the largest British force in the colonies, yet his intelligence network failed to predict Washington's movements reliably. British officers suspected leaks. They interrogated civilians, monitored newspapers, and even attempted to recruit American double agents. In this atmosphere of paranoia, the risks for the Culper Ring multiplied. Townsend's position was precarious. He operated a business in the heart of New York, surrounded by loyalists and British soldiers. His life depended on silence and restraint. Every casual conversation in a crowded room could reveal a tiny piece of information. Every misplaced gesture could draw suspicion. Abraham Woodhull, the Ring's original operative in Long Island, faced constant danger from neighbors who questioned his frequent trips to New York. His family endured the strain of secrecy. His fields went untended, his home life disrupted. War had arrived not through battle, but through unanswered questions and watchful eyes. The sacrifices of America's first spies were not always bloody, they were psychological, emotional, personal. Their battles were fought internally: how to deceive friends without losing their trust, how to risk their families without showing fear, how to remain invisible without disappearing entirely. Caleb Brewster, perhaps the boldest member of the network, carried messages across Long Island Sound under the cover of darkness. His routes were perilous: patrol boats prowled the water, loyalist militias guarded the coast, and storms could capsize small boats easily. Brewster was more than a courier, he was the bridge connecting Townsend's urban intelligence to Washington's command. His skill on the water turned geography into opportunity. The British saw New York's waterways as barriers. The Culper Ring saw them as arteries of information, yet the Ring's greatest challenge came not from the British, but from the nature of espionage itself. Secrecy isolates. It breeds doubt. Townsend and Woodhull operated with minimal contact, incapable of revealing their identities to others. They could not share their burden, seek reassurance, or take pride in success. Their victories were silent, their failures known only to themselves. And while Washington honored their work, their names remained hidden even from the army they served. This anonymity protected them, but it also prevented recognition that might have strengthened their resolve. Meanwhile, the revolution outside the shadows reached its peak. The French alliance was now decisive. Troops under the Comte de Rochambeau marched alongside Washington, and French naval commanders challenged British dominance at sea. The American army, transformed by training at Valley Forge, fought with discipline that shocked British officers who remembered the ragged militias of 1776. Everywhere, the revolution was evolving, from protest to strategy, from desperation to organized resistance, but success did not erase hardship. Mutinies erupted in 1781 as Continental soldiers, starving and unpaid, refused to march. Congress struggled with debt. Inflation devastated families. The unity of the colonies, always fragile, stretched to its breaking point under the weight of sacrifice. Internal conflicts between states, between political factions, and between personal interests threatened the fragile alliance. In this climate, espionage became even more critical, not only against the British, but against the possibility of collapse from within. Washington recognized that his army was a mirror of the nation's soul. If it fractured, so would the dream of independence. So he continued to weave the threads of secrecy through every decision. He fed false information to British informants, distracting them with rumors. He exaggerated troop numbers. He hid his real plans from his own officers, revealing details only at the final moment. This secrecy confused the British so thoroughly that when Washington prepared to strike the final blow at Yorktown, they still believed he was preparing to invade New York. At the peak of the revolution, deception became the weapon that shaped victory. French troops marched north from Rhode Island, then suddenly turned south. American forces that seemed scattered converged like a tightening fist. Cornwallis, commanding British forces in the south, found himself trapped between Washington's army and the French navy. The siege at Yorktown did not just happen, it was engineered through information. The Culper Ring's reports confirmed British troop movements. Franklin's diplomacy secured French timing. Washington's deception ensured surprise, and yet, amid these triumphs, the challenges persisted. British spies still operated across the colonies. Loyalist communities, especially in the South, waged their own war against Patriot forces. Families were divided. Violence flared in villages and fields far from the formal battle lines. The revolution was not a clean struggle of armies, it was a civil war in many places, with neighbor turned against neighbor. Spies did not merely move between opposing camps, they moved through communities torn apart by ideology. This internal conflict created constant danger for American intelligence networks. Loyalist militias in New York, the Carolinas, and New Jersey hunted suspected patriots ruthlessly. British officers offered rewards for information. Prison ships anchored in New York Harbor became places of horror, where captured spies and soldiers suffered in darkness. The secret war carried the promise of victory, but it came with the cost of fear. Every message was a gamble. Every success brought a new layer of risk, yet in this crucible of danger and determination, the American identity solidified. The revolution was no longer a rebellion against laws, it was a quest for self-definition. The nation to be was forged not only on battlefields, but in kitchens where whispers shaped decisions, in taverns where coded conversations changed plans, and in fields where signals passed unseen between farms. America's first spies were the unseen hands guiding a nation toward its birth. By 1781, the peak of the revolt had arrived. A fragile coalition, patriots, diplomats, French allies, hidden spies, pressed toward the final chapter. The challenges had nearly destroyed the revolution. But they had also honed it into something unbreakable. The secret war had become a craft, a discipline, and ultimately, a legacy. The world would remember battles like Saratoga and Yorktown, but without the silent victories in the shadows, those triumphs might never have come. The peak of the revolution was a moment of balance, between success and collapse, between unity and fracture, between freedom and fear. And in the middle of that balance stood the quiet figures working in the dark, America's first spies, whose invisible courage shaped the fate of the revolution. On October 19, 1781, silence followed the thunder. The guns at Yorktown fell still, and British General Cornwallis surrendered his army to the combined American and French forces. The moment would soon be celebrated in paintings and songs, remembered as the great triumph that ended the American Revolution. But the truth was more complex. Yorktown was not the end, it was the beginning of negotiations, doubts, and delicate diplomacy. Victory did not immediately create a nation, it created a fragile opportunity. In that fragile window, the work of espionage did not stop. It evolved. The same secrecy that had protected the revolution now had to protect peace. When the Treaty of Paris was finally signed in 1783, Great Britain recognized the independence of the United States. The dream that once whispered through taverns and hidden messages across Long Island Sound became a new reality, a nation born from ink, sacrifice, and silence. Yet the meaning of that victory went far beyond independence. The secret war had changed the mindset of the revolutionaries forever. It taught them that information is power, that national security would require more than armies, and that freedom must always protect itself from threats seen and unseen. In the aftermath of the war, many of America's first spies blended back into ordinary life. Their names remained hidden, their work unacknowledged. Robert Townsend returned to his business in New York, carrying his memories quietly until his death. Abraham Woodhull returned to his farm, bearing the weight of years spent lying to friends, neighbors, and British officers. Caleb Brewster moved on with his life, his daring missions lost to the tides of history. Even Benjamin Talmadge, whose design changed the course of espionage, kept his work secret in his lifetime, though he later served as a respected public figure. Their contributions would remain buried in dusty codebooks and faded letters until historians uncovered the truth more than a century later. This silence was not a failure of recognition, it was part of the victory itself. Washington understood that a spy's greatest honor was anonymity. To reveal their names was to expose their families to hatred, vengeance, or political manipulation. The Culper Rings succeeded not only because they gathered intelligence, but because they remained invisible. Their legacy was written not in monuments, but in the survival of the nation they helped create. George Washington emerged from the war not only as the commander who defeated the British, but as the architect of America's earliest intelligence system. His personal experiences with betrayal, coded messages, double agents, and deception shaped his understanding of leadership. Washington believed deeply that no government could survive without the protection of information. As the first president of the United States, he institutionalized that belief. In private correspondence, Washington advocated for intelligence funding and the use of confidential informants. He recognized the need for secrecy within a democracy, not to hide truth from citizens, but to shield the nation from foreign influence. In his presidency, Washington used secret budgets to establish surveillance networks and pay agents operating overseas. This was the seed that would grow into America's modern intelligence community. Benjamin Franklin's legacy extended far beyond diplomacy. His mastery of strategic communication, his ability to shape perception as power, became foundational to American foreign policy. Franklin understood that ideas travel faster than armies, and his work in France proved that influence could win wars. Today, the use of psychological strategy, public diplomacy, and controlled narratives remains rooted in Franklin's approach. He transformed the very idea of warfare, making room for persuasion where violence once ruled alone. John Jay's contribution laid the groundwork for counterintelligence in America. His Committee for Detecting Conspiracies was more than a temporary solution, it was a model for future institutions dedicated to identifying threats within the nation's borders. Jay believed that loyalty must be tested, not assumed. His work exposed traitors and protected the revolution from collapse at a time when civil war lurked beneath every argument. That philosophy lives on in the security protocols and internal intelligence structures that protect the United States to this day, but perhaps the most profound impact of the secret war lies not only in the strategies it created, but in the idea it preserved, that ordinary people, acting with extraordinary courage, can change the destiny of a nation. America's first spies were not aristocrats or military elites, they were farmers, merchants, widows, teachers, craftsmen. Their hands were calloused not from weapons, but from work. They belonged to no hierarchy. They were invisible in their time, and yet their acts shaped the world we live in today. This reality reshapes the story of the American Revolution away from a saga of grand generals and toward a story of collective sacrifice. The influence of the secret war can also be seen globally. The American Revolution was the first major modern conflict where espionage played a central role in victory for a weaker force against a dominant empire. Future revolutions, from Latin America to Europe, would study the clandestine techniques used by Washington and his network. Later, in the 20th century, when the world entered an era of global espionage, historians looked back and discovered that many foundational methods, coded systems, invisible links, dead drops, deception operations, had already existed in the late 18th century, practiced by men and women who had no formal training, only necessity and courage. Yet there is a deeper emotional legacy to this hidden struggle. War is often told through victories, generals, and battlefield tactics, but the secret war asks us to think differently about bravery. What does it mean to risk everything without praise? To move silently through danger without recognition? To tell lies for a higher truth? The spies of the revolution lived with constant fear, not fear of the battlefield's chaos, but fear of discovery, interrogation, execution.